having a child, assuming it's intentional, it's the most optimistic thing that somebody could do.
This seemingly evident and very much talked about issue didn't come to the forefront of the conversation, and these incredibly intelligent men weren't able to kind of figure this out. It was interesting to see. When Musk and Peterson sat down for an interview recently, one of the key issues that came up as a main topic of concern for Elon Musk: declining birth rates around the world. And if you think you don't really care because it doesn't affect you, you're probably wrong. The conversation started out talking about birth rates and population decrease, population control, and then it took a dark turn. There's two reasons I'm bringing this up. Firstly, I'm really shocked. I'm surprised that no one else is talking about this, because I thought some really interesting things came out of that part of the conversation. But also, I want to bring up what we can learn from this. Elon Musk talked about the downward trend, with birth rates trending downward towards, if not already below, replacement rates. He said,
if these trends continue, most countries will dwindle into insignificance. They might completely die out.
Now, the conversation that ensued from this navigated some philosophical nuances, probably pushed by Peterson. One of the things that was discussed or suggested was that when a culture loses its religion, it starts to become anti-natalist and decline in numbers to the point of potentially disappearing. So the suggestion being that there's a religious component to declining birth rates, and Peterson further sort of theorized that hedonism and power are the two main forces that come in to replace God, or the idea of God, the religion, in a society once that society lets go of their faith.
Give me an example.
I suppose the Western world is a prime example because of the rise of atheism, and perhaps correlating with the rise of science and the key role that plays in Western society, and the way that it has slowly replaced spiritual and religious components in everyday life, in society in general.
I often turn to a force greater than myself. Religion? Star Trek.
So the way the conversation kind of went from there was the idea that a decline in birth rates might be a natural consequence of prosperity.
What did he say?
And here's where it starts to get interesting. So again, with prosperity or unchecked prosperity, there's this idea that there's nothing to check our unlimited ability to fulfill wants and needs. And this makes sense on an individual level, and I suppose it's sort of extrapolated to make sense in a group setting as well, with a sort of idea that you can get away with it because the consequences don't touch you, and because there's no threats or worries or concerns in the horizon. So the individual or the group are sort of left to their own devices and to attend to these impulses. One of the comments was that if you're a civilization under threat, there's no time for hedonism because you're constantly under threat, constantly under duress.
Fear of extinction.
There's other priorities taking precedent. And the example that was given was that of a spoiled child. So society, like a spoiled child, doesn't make the best decisions, such as allowing birth rates to decline left unchecked. Basically, in broad strokes, that was sort of where the conversation was going. Basically, one of the logical conclusions from here was that to curtail the hedonism and all of these impulses, the solution to this is an existential threat, similar to war.
Sparta!
So, in a way, it was almost suggested that the moral equivalent is needed to set society on the right path. And something potentially concerning also came up, which is Peterson's contention that wealth or prosperity facilitate this primordial state. As I was saying, with this comparison to a spoiled child, then if there's unlimited resources and too much prosperity, bringing it back to this philosophical hierarchy of development, he almost seemed to equate this wealth, this unlimited prosperity without an existential threat like war, with immaturity.
Not everyone's as egregiously selfish as you are.
In fact, he contended that maturity itself consists of two processes, basically two processes of bringing a broader scope into our purview of the primary unit. So on the one hand, bringing more people into our purview of responsibility and care. So for instance, not just the self, but also family, community, as well as being able to care about the future.
But this isn't just about our future. It's about everyone's.
So caring about the future and being able to think ahead and expand our responsibilities from the self and the present to a broader sense of community, which is sort of what he contends the cortex is for, to move away from primordial hedonistic motivation to a more inclusive sense of community and of the future, which would be the higher order self. So they also contended that this issue with the declining birth rates is a marker of demoralization because people are no longer committing to each other or to the future, meaning that procreation is a marker of having faith in the future, having that optimism for the future, and being able to project and plan ahead in that way. To illustrate this point, I have a quote from the conversation.
Having a kid is a vote for the future. So if you intend to have a child like that, that means you care about the future.
Yeah. You believe in the future.
You believe in the future.
Yeah.
Having a child, assuming it's intentional, is it's the most optimistic thing that somebody could do.
So basically, the conclusion of this part of the conversation was that, having children is a reflection of faith
and courage
and optimism in the future. And Jordan Peterson went as far as to say that it's a sign of courage to have children, in that he seemed to equate having a child in uncertain times, so bringing a child into the world in the midst of financial insecurity, housing insecurity, food insecurity, or uncertain times, with a vote of courage or a vote in that direction. And if you're wondering what that means, you would have to ask him. There's a couple of reasons why this is important. There's so many layers to this. One of the more surprising things is that they both seemed to be genuinely, or they presented the conversation as though they were genuinely concerned and confused about why this was happening. They were trying to figure out why birth rates keep declining. Just interesting and almost hard to believe that, here you have the smartest guy in the world and he cannot figure out why birth rates are declining, why people are having a hard time committing to having kids, when the answer seems a little too simple and too obvious, considering we're in a cost of living crisis, and this is pretty universal. It's particularly hard-hitting in the States and Canada, North America. It's been widely reported that millennials and Gen Z are the first generation to be officially worse off than their parents. So the way generational wealth distribution works is that each generation manages to be a little better off than the generation prior to them. And you see this all across the board. Usually kids manage to do better than their parents. They're either afforded better education through their parents' sacrifices or better career prospects. But this generation is different. It's the complete opposite. Bobby Kennedy Jr. has been very outspoken and very clear in his message and his explanation of inflation and how it's working as an additional tax on younger generations by diluting wealth transfers and deeming them less and less profitable.
The average home in our country 2 years ago was $215,000. Today it's $400,000. And so kids today, like your kids and my kids, are never going to buy a home.
So there's lots of different claims of how and why this may be happening. But at the root of it, if we just look at the root of some of the ways in which younger generations are experiencing financial insecurity, is housing. Right now, whereas it used to take previous generations 2, 3 to 4 times their annual salary to be able to purchase a home, current generations need to spend at least 7 times the annual salary. And in bigger cities like San Francisco, LA, Toronto, Vancouver, this is all the way up to 12 to 13 times the annual salary.
I grew up in an America that seemed to have achieved its promise. Working Americans could provide for their families on a single salary. They could buy a home, raise a family, save for retirement without mountains of debt.
What this means is that if you think of salary increasing over time, more or less at the rate of inflation to account for inflationary price changes, then what this means is that housing prices have been increasing at rates exponentially higher than the rate of inflation.
You can't afford that house. Can you afford that house?
And there's lots of other issues and evidence of our current generations, younger generations struggle with financial security. Food insecurity continues to be an issue. Statistics show that in response to the cost of living crisis, people are cutting down on food and turning to lower quality food options.
Free food always tastes good.
The question becomes, is it even ethical for people who cannot offer food security and housing security and financial security to a child? Is it even ethical to have children? It really does become a moral dilemma for younger generations.
But I think I'm going to love it.
And I do find it really interesting that this seemingly evident and very much talked about issue didn't come to the forefront of the conversation, and these incredibly intelligent men weren't able to kind of figure this out. You know, they were confused, perhaps because they're so far detached from the issues. It's possible, but it was interesting to see. Now, here's why it matters. There's levels to this, right? At the most basic foundational level, it seems surprisingly ignorant of the issues, kind of detached from this reality. The fact that they kind of kept pushing towards a spiritual or faith-based solution was disappointing.
You sure you're a real priest?
And specifically concerning that they seemed to identify a warlike existential threat as the solution or the incentive that would put population growth and population planning back on track. To make matters worse, Peterson later posted a message on X, formerly Twitter, and I'm going to read from this message because it's very much related to this part of the conversation. He sort of starts off by saying it is probably better to get married when you're young because then you grow up. So we're starting out with very weak logic here, also incredibly archaic, but then it just keeps getting worse. So he goes on to state, and then what else matures people? I have met very few people who have fully matured who do not have children. I think there is a reason for that, a real technical reason. You are not mature until someone else matters more than you, period. Maybe that will be your wife or husband, but probably not. As if a wife or husband is the first degree of separation from the self, which is as if family didn't exist or didn't matter, as if being a daughter, a son, a sibling doesn't really compute. But that's not the case for most people. And that's really just very surprising to see. There's so many people who take care of family members, not to mention religious vocations, religious leaders. So many people who take on a religious vocation don't have families of their own, but still take care of other people within their communities.
I know. Why are you telling me things that I already know?
Sorry.
You know?
Yes.
There's career vocations from healthcare, social workers, foster care. There are so many institutions in society where people show up every day, make countless sacrifices, and consistently put other people's needs ahead of their own. I mean, there's heads of state, religious leaders, CEOs, just lots of people in positions of responsibility of really having to take care of countless families on their shoulders. And I'm not sure what the connection with having kids has to do with that.
You do know that this isn't a hobby, right?
What isn't a hobby?
This job.
Oh, of course.
And finally, there's the other side of the coin, which is this false equivalency that having a kid makes you a mature person or gives you maturity. So I'm just trying to understand the logic here and the really, really kind of closed-minded assertion or false equivalency that being a parent necessarily makes you a good parent.
We raised 2 kids.
Raised might be a stretch. Our nursery was in a different wing of the house.
It's a design flaw.
So right off the bat, this is incredibly disappointing and filled with, honestly, quite backward mentality and illogical. Absolutely illogical.
Why don't you tell us how you really feel?
Also, there seems to be an issue attached to this in the sense that, you know, obviously Peterson is a father, he has kids. So this is a very seemingly self-serving statement. Sadly and ironically, this is a really, really bad look because this post came right after Elon Musk's daughter came out with statements about, you know, Musk's sort of parenting style, and it's just overall the timing was awful. It was a very bad look for everyone involved. But moving on, and to kind of close this off, the rest of this statement on X goes on as follows. They, meaning the wife or husband, might matter as much as you, and maybe that is the right amount. But when you have children, they matter more than you, unless there is something seriously wrong with you. Very few parents, if push came to shove, would not die for their children. As soon as someone else matters more than you do in some fundamental sense, you have taken another step toward a true, mature responsibility. And I'll end the quote here because I think, again, this goes to the false equivalency between having kids and having the maturity to care for something or someone other than the self, or caring for someone more than yourself. Anyone can have kids. There's no requirements to have kids.
It's the second easiest job in the world, being a mom.
I love shopping.
So there's this, you know, false equivalency or this suggestion that having kids will magically make you a good parent when that is not the case. Having kids is not a transformation that will suddenly make you more generous or more prepared to raise that child. So it does become, again, this moral dilemma. In fact, if you don't already have that maturity of being able to care for someone else and put somebody else's needs ahead of your own, you don't already have that ability to take care of your community, you probably shouldn't be having kids. you're probably not ready. You're probably not mature enough to have kids. This isn't something that will magically change once you have kids. There's 3 levels to these statements. The first one being this apparent ignorance of what the issues behind declining birth rates are. There seems to be, on a foundational level, there seems to be a real misunderstanding of the complex issues behind declining birth rates.
I don't know how I missed it. I'm usually very observant.
Then the next level is a real sense of irresponsibility and an almost mediocre approach to maturity. These assertions don't really make any sense. There's no logical rationale behind it. And it's quite disappointing to even see an assertion like this, being put forward like that, because there's no intelligent argument that's being made to support it. There's no curiosity ignited. It's just plain. It seems facetious and irresponsible to make the assertion or suggest that having children will make you mature enough to take care of that child. This goes against one of the biggest problems that we've been trying to tackle for years, which is unsafe and lack of planning, particularly among younger adults, as well as a very mediocre understanding of parenthood.
Really?
And then finally, there's the third and higher level question, which is the motivations behind this. So what is really driving this concern with population growth or population control? Why is this a priority? Why is this such an important question? Why is this a main concern at the moment? Is it a spiritual journey that that they happen to be on, where it's become really important to them to figure out what is driving declining birth rates, to see populations grow? Is it a concern with declining birth rates as a means of production? It could be a question of lower rates of human capital for future generations. Or it could be that the means of production aren't really the question or the problem, particularly with the rise of AI. And it could be that the main concern is declining future consumers and a shrinking pool of potential consumers to drive the economy. So these are certainly questions that need to be considered to ascertain the objectivity of these statements and suggestions.